a liberal allowance of sea room, and Mr. Shute, who could not be numbered among such, and had as usual taken up a position as near to Miss Sally as possible, was rewarded by a double knock on his horse's ribs that was a cause of heartless mirth to the lady of his affections. Not a hound had as yet spoken, but they were forcing their way through the gorse forest and shoving each other jealously aside with growing excitement, and Flurry could be seen at intervals moving forward in the direction they were indicating. It was at this juncture that the ubiquitous Slipper presented himself at my horse's shoulder. "'Tis for the river he's making, Major," he said, with an upward roll of his squinting eyes that nearly made me seasick. "He's a Castle Knox fox that came in this morning, and you should get ahead down to the ford." A tip from Slipper was not to be neglected, and Philippa and I began a cautious progress through the gorse, followed by Miss Knox as quietly as Moonlighter's nerves would permit. "Wishful has it," she exclaimed, as a hound came into view, uttered a sharp yelp, and drove forward. "Hark, hark!" roared Flurry, with at least three R's reverberating in each hark. At the same instant came a holloa from the farther side of the river, and Dr. Hickey's renowned and blood-curdling screech was uplifted at the bottom of the covert. Then Babel broke forth as the hounds, converging from every quarter, flung themselves shrieking on the line. Moonlighter went straight up on his hind legs, and dropped again with a bound that sent him crushing past Philippa and Crusquine. He did it a second time, and was almost on to the tail of the Quaker, whose bulky person was not to be hurried in any emergency. "Get on if you can, Major Yates," called out Sally, steadying the grey as well as she could in the narrow pathway between the great gorse bushes. Other horses were thundering behind us; men were shouting to each other in similar passages right and left of us; the cry of the hounds filled the air with a kind of delirium. A low wall with a stick laid along it barred the passage in front of me, and the Quaker firmly and immediately decided not to have it until someone else had dislodged the pole. "Go ahead!" I shouted, squeezing to one side with heroic disregard of the furze bushes and my new tops. The words were hardly out of my mouth when Moonlighter, mad with thwarted excitement, shot by me, hurtled over the obstacle with extravagant fury, landed 12 feet beyond it on clattering slippery rock, saved himself from falling with an eel-like forward buck on to sedgy ground, and bolted at full speed down the muddy cattle track. There are corners, rocky most of them, in that cattle track, that Sally has told me she will remember to her dying day, boggy holes of any depth ranging between 2 feet and halfway to Australia, that she says she does not fail to mention in the general thanksgiving. But at the time they occupied mere fractions of the strenuous seconds in which it was hopeless for her to do anything but try to steer, trust to luck, sit down hard into the saddle, and try to stay there. For my part, I would as soon try to adhere to the horns of a charging bull as to the crutches of a side saddle; but happily the necessity is not likely to arise. I saw Flurry Knox a little ahead of her on the same track. Jamming his mare into the furze bushes to get out of her way, he shouted something after her about the ford, and started to gallop for it himself by a breakneck short cut. The hounds were already across the river, and it was obvious that, ford or no ford, Moonlighter's intentions might be simply expressed in the formula, "Be with them I will." It was all downhill to the river, and among the furze bushes and rocks there was neither time nor place to turn him. He rushed at it with a shattering slip upon a streak of rock, with a heavy plunge in the deep ground by the brink. It was as bad a take off for 20 feet of water as could well be found. The grey horse rose out of the boggy stuff with all the impetus that pace and temper could give, but it was not enough. For one instant the twisting, sliding current was under Sally; the next a veil of water sprang up all around her, and Moonlighter was rolling and lurching in the desperate effort to find foothold in the rocky bed of the stream. I was following at the best pace I could kick out of the Quaker, and saw the water swirl into her lap as her horse rolled to the near side. She caught the mane to save herself, but he struggled on to his legs again and came floundering broadside on to the farther bank. In 3 seconds she had got out of the saddle and flung herself at the bank, grasping the rushes and trying, in spite of the sodden weight of her habit, to drag herself out of the water. At the same instant I saw Flurry and the brown mare dashing through the ford 20 yards higher up. He was off his horse and beside her, with that uncanny quickness that Flurry reserved for moments of emergency, and, catching her by the arms, swung her on to the bank as easily as if she had been the kennel terrier. "Catch the horse!" she called out, scrambling to her feet. "Damn the horse!" returned Flurry, in the rage that is so often reaction from a bad scare. I turned along the bank and made for the ford. By this time it was full of hustling, splashing riders, through whom Bernard Shute, furiously picking a bad start, drove a devastating way. He tried to turn his horse down the bank towards Miss Knox, but the hounds were running hard, and to my intense amusement Stockbroker refused to abandon the chase, and swept his rider away in the wake of his stable companion, Dr. Hickey's young chestnut. By this time 2 country boys had, as usual in such cases, risen from the earth and fished Moonlighter out of the stream. Miss Sally wound up an acrimonious argument with her cousin by observing that she didn't care what he said, and, placing her water-logged boot in his obviously unwilling hand, in a second was again in the saddle, gathering up the wet reins with the trembling, clumsy fingers of a person who is thoroughly chilled and in a violent hurry. She set Moonlighter going, and was away in a moment, galloping him at the first fence at a pace that suited his steeple-chasing ideas. "Mr. Knox," panted Philippa, who had by this time joined us, "make her go home." "She can go where she likes, as far as I'm concerned," responded Mr. Knox, pitching himself on his mare's back and digging in the spurs. Moonlighter had already glided over the bank in front of us, with a perfunctory flick at it with his heels. Flurry's mare and Kruskin jumped it side by side with equal precision. It was a bank of some 5 feet high. The Quaker charged it enthusiastically, refused it abruptly, and, according to his infuriating custom at such moments, proceeded to tear hurried mouthfuls of grass. "Will I give him a couple of belts, your honour?" shouted one of the running accompaniment of country boys. "You will," said I, with some further remarks to the Quaker that I need not commit to paper. Swish! Whack! The sound was music in my ears, as the good, remorseless ash sapling bent round the Quaker's dappled hindquarters. At the 3rd stripe he launched both his heels in the operator's face. At the 4th he reared undecidedly. At the 5th he bundled over the bank in a manner purged of hesitation. "Ha!" yelled my assistants. "That'll put a fear o' God in him," as the Quaker fled headlong after the hunt. "He'll be the better o' that while he lives." Without going quite as far as this, I must admit for the next half hour he was astonishingly the better of it. The Castle Knox fox was making a very pretty line of it over the 7 miles that separated him from his home. He headed through a grassy country of Ireland's mild and brilliant green, fenced with sound and buxom banks, enlivened by stone walls, uncompromised by the presence of gates, and yet comfortably laced with lanes for the furtherance of those who had laid to heart Wolsey's valuable advice: "Fling away ambition, by that sin fell the angels." The flotsam and jetsam of the hunt pervaded the landscape. Standing on one long bank, 3 dismounted farmers flogged away at the refusing steeds below them, like anglers trying to rise a sulky fish. Half a dozen hats bobbing in a string showed where the road riders followed the delusive windings of a boccherine. It was obvious that in the matter of ambition they would not have caused Cardinal Wolsey a moment's uneasiness. Whether angels or otherwise, they were not going to run any risk of falling. Flurry's red coat was like a beacon 2 fields ahead of me, with Philippa following in his tracks. It was the first run worthy of the name that Philippa had ridden, and I blessed Miss Bobby Bennet as I saw Kruskin's undefeated fencing. An encouraging twang of the doctor's horn notified that the hounds were giving us a chance. Even the Quaker pricked his blunt ears and swerved in his stride to the sound. A stone wall, a rough patch of heather, a boggy field, dinted deep and black with hoof marks, and the stern chase was at an end. The hounds had checked on the outskirts of a small wood, and the field, thinned down to a panting dozen or so, viewed us with the disfavour shown by the first flight towards those who unexpectedly add to their select number. In the depths of the wood Dr. Hickey might be heard uttering those singular little yelps of encouragement that to the irreverent suggest a milkman in his